Glenn Raymond Tipton, a name that is inextricably linked with the most brilliant minds in heavy metal, is known for his thunderous melodies and blazing solos. He and Judas Priest transformed the stage into a battlefield for more than 4 decades, where music served as their weapon and each melody had the capacity to sway an entire generation. However, fate consistently places the greatest among us to the proof. Glenn Tipton was compelled to engage in the most significant conflict of his life as Judas Priest continued to dominate the globe. A battle without stage lights, roaring crowds, or anything else but himself, as Parkinson's disease, a silent adversary, gradually erodes his capacity to perform music on a daily basis. From a child in Blackheath who loved blues to a heavy metal legend, from timeless hits such as Painkiller and Breaking the Law to the moment he had to step away from the stage, Glenn Tipton's journey is characterized by a steadfast spirit that refuses to wane, as well as triumph and tragedy. However, how did Glenn Tipton's narrative commence prior to his transformation into the individual who influenced Judas Priest and prior to his confrontation with his greatest adversary? Let us return to the very beginning, to the inception of a heavy metal legend. Early life. Glenn Raymond Tipton was an ordinary child growing up in Blackheath, Staffordshire, England, before he became one of the greatest guitarists in heavy metal. No one could have anticipated that this reserved adolescent would one day be the one to determine the fate of Judas Priest and leave an indelible impression on the rock music industry. Glenn Raymond Tipton was born on October 25, 1947, in Blackheath, Staffordshire, England, into a family that had a profound appreciation for music. Glenn's early years were not characterized by an affinity for the electrifying, forceful music that would later define him as a legendary heavy metal guitarist. Not roaring electric guitars or explosive riffs, but gentle, classical melodies from the piano played by his mother, were the first sounds he encountered. Glenn's musical sensibilities were significantly influenced by his mother, a pianist. She frequently engaged in recreational activities at her residence. Glenn was afforded the opportunity to comprehend music theory at a much earlier age than most children by being surrounded by delicate harmonies. He was not a child who was particularly energetic or outspoken. Rather, he was reserved and introspective, seeking solace in music, a realm in which he could freely investigate his emotions. Glenn initiated his piano studies with the assistance of his mother. His natural talent was evident in his rapid mastery of the instrument. However, the piano never fully captured his attention, despite his abilities. He was able to appreciate its beauty, but he felt that something was missing, a sensation of freedom and an intense energy that the piano keys could not provide. The pivotal moment occurred when his elder brother, Gary Tipton, brought home an electric guitar. Glenn was captivated by the raw, electrifying sound, which the piano had never provided him with, the instant he touched the strings. Gary was responsible for instructing Glenn on his initial chords. However, unlike numerous guitar prodigies, Glenn did not immediately grasp the concept. He endured months of frustration with the fretboard, grappling with each note until he was able to effectively manage the instrument. Nevertheless, Glenn's persistence and determination, which would later characterize his playing style, prevented him from becoming discouraged. Not dependent on pure speed, but rather on precision, emotion, and fluidity. I developed a profound appreciation for the blues as a result of growing up during the golden era of rock and roll, when bands such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who dominated the scene. Prioritizing the emotion in each note over flamboyant techniques, he spent hours listening to and practicing alongside artists such as Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, and Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac. He progressively integrated music into his daily routine, transforming it from a mere pastime into a genuine passion. Glenn's first employment was as a machinist, which necessitated both precision and patience, prior to his complete dedication to a career in music. However, he was unable to separate himself from his instrument, regardless of what he did. He dedicated every spare moment to practicing, playing in small venues, and seeking an opportunity to transform his passion into a career. Later, fate led him to a life-altering encounter that would introduce a blues-loving young man to the world of heavy metal and permanently alter it. Career in its infancy. Glenn Tipton was aware that music was more than a mere pastime after he discovered his affection for the guitar. It was his fate. However, the journey to becoming a heavy metal legend was never straightforward. Glenn spent years of struggle experimenting with various styles and refining the guitar techniques that would later characterize an entire generation before becoming the musical mastermind of Judas Priest. Glenn Tipton's professional career commenced in the early 1970s with the Flying Hat Band, a hard rock ensemble that was influenced by the music of Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin. This period was instrumental in the development of Glenn's stage presence, the refinement of his guitar technique, and the extension of his comprehension of the music industry. A signature trait that Glenn would later introduce to Judas Priest, the band concentrated on complex riffs and extended solos. The Flying Hat Band was able to open for Deep Purple, one of the finest rock bands of that era, as a result of his natural talent and unwavering dedication. This experience enabled Glenn to acquire knowledge from guitar legends such as Ritchie Blackmore. Nevertheless, the Flying Hat Ensemble was unable to become a success, despite their potential. They were ultimately disbanded prior to the release of any albums, as they were unable to secure a significant record contract. An early failure could have resulted in the demise of a goal for numerous musicians. However, Glenn Tipton was not one to surrender. Upon the closure of one door, a much larger and more significant one was revealed. Judas Priest was in the process of composing their debut album, Rock'n'Rolla, in 1974, however, they were still in quest of a definitive musical direction. The band was influenced by progressive rock and blues rock at the time, but they lacked a unique approach. Glenn Tipton arrived at the ideal juncture to provide the band with a second guitarist and solidify their sound. Glenn contributed a new perspective, innovative songwriting, masterful technique, and sharper melodies from the instant he joined. However, his dynamic partnership with KK was likely the most significant element he introduced. Downing. Within Judas Priest, an ideal complement. Tipton contributed melodic precision, complexity, and structure, in contrast to Downing's preference for a raw, aggressive, and wild playing style. Together, they rapidly established one of the most exceptional twin guitar duos in the annals of heavy metal, a formula that had never been applied to this extent before. Despite the fact that Rock'n'Rolla was not a commercial success, the band had ultimately identified the sound they wished to pursue. Judas Priest had officially entered the most critical phase of their voyage, one that would revolutionize the landscape of heavy metal. However, a lengthy journey was still ahead of them before they could conquer the globe. Glenn Tipton had entered the band that would significantly influence his career. However, this was merely the beginning of a storied and prosperous career. Glenn Tipton was instrumental in the band's transformation into one of the most enduring heavy metal icons, as he was not merely another new member when he joined Judas Priest in 1974. Judas Priest was still in the process of experimenting with progressive rock and blues rock during their early years. However, the introduction of Tipton catapulted them into a new era, characterized by razor-sharp riffs, explosive melodies, and an uncompromising spirit. The album Sad Wings of Destiny was the first significant contribution that Tipton made to Judas Priest. 1976, this marked a significant departure from Rock'n'Rolla, as it introduced compositions that were more emotionally intense, forceful, and dark. Particularly in compositions such as The Ripper and Victim of Changes, Tipton was critical in both songwriting and guitar work. His playing technique was in harmony with KK. Judas Priest would later establish a signature element by precisely Downing, which achieved a balance between technical precision and wild aggression. This chemistry continued to develop as Judas Priest transitioned from a hard rock band to a full-fledged heavy metal juggernaut, as evidenced by Hellbent for Leather, 1979, and Stained Class, 1978. Judas Priest introduced a more aggressive, sharper, and clearer sound to rock music, which at the time still consisted of strong blues elements. Exciter and other tracks became essential components of speed metal. Tipton was not only an extraordinary guitarist by this point, but also a prolific songwriter who significantly influenced the band's trajectory. The most significant turning point was the release of British Steel in 1980, which solidified Judas Priest's status as a dominant force in the heavy metal genre. Not only did songs such as Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight dominate the rankings, but they also revolutionized the perception of heavy metal. Rivets, motorcycles, leather jackets, and a rebellious yet calculated aesthetic. Tipton demonstrated that he was not only a technical guitar master, but also a composer who could create basic yet electrifying melodies that catapulted Judas Priest to global fame. Glenn Tipton was the driving force behind Judas Priest's golden heyday in the 1980s. From 1982's Screaming for Vengeance, which featured Electric Eye and You've Got Another Thing Comin', to 1984's Defenders of the Faith. Each album pushed the boundaries of creativity while simultaneously delivering a relentless heavy metal sound. Tipton's guitar techniques were constantly refined during this period, resulting in the creation of some of the most iconic solos in metal history by combining speed, precision, and emotion. Nevertheless, prosperity was not without its obstacles. Judas Priest encountered one of the most peculiar lawsuits in the annals of music in 1990. The families of two adolescents, Raymond Belknap and James Vance, who allegedly attempted suicide after being influenced by Stained Class, 1978, filed a lawsuit against the band. The families alleged that the song Better Buy You Better Than Me contained subliminal messages that encouraged suicide. Tipton and the band were required to defend themselves against unfounded accusations during the months-long trial. Ultimately, Judas Priest was acquitted, but the litigation left an unwelcome stain on their career, as Tipton famously remarked in response to the claims. Judas Priest achieved new heights with Painkiller, 1990, after surmounting this controversy. This album was the pinnacle of their speed and intensity, with lightning-fast melodies and blistering solos that electrified every stage. Painkiller was an all-out explosion of shredding, tapping, and breakneck riffing, whereas Tipton's previous technique retained melodic and bluesy elements. The album also served as a conduit between Judas Priest and the subsequent generation of metal musicians, inspiring guitarists such as Dimebag Darrell, Pantera, Zakk Wylde, and Sinister Gates, Avenged Sevenfold. However, a significant disaster struck just as Judas Priest was reaching their peak. In 1992, Rob Halford departed the band. This placed Judas Priest in a precarious situation, and internal tensions began to escalate. In the 1990s, Glenn Tipton and K.K. With Tim "Ripper" Owens replacing Halford, Downing encountered difficulty in maintaining the band's financial stability. Judas Priest's former grandeur was unable to be reclaimed, and tensions between Tipton and Downing intensified, despite their efforts. K.K. Tipton was publicly criticized by Downing for exercising excessive control over the band. Downing suggested in his autobiography, Heavy Duty, Days and Nights in Judas Priest, that Tipton had a greater impact on the band's decisions than even Rob Halford or the management. The band appeared to regain stability upon Halford's return in 2003, however, the rift between Tipton and Downing never completely healed. Tipton had already achieved the status of a living legend by that time. Nevertheless, he persisted in his efforts to challenge creative limitations, demonstrating the immense force of Judas Priest with songs such as Judas Rising. Despite his advanced age, his fervor for heavy metal persisted, as evidenced by Nostradamus, 2008, an ambitious concept album. In 2011, when K.K. Downing accused Tipton and the band's management of cultivating a poisonous work environment when he declared his departure from Judas Priest. Glenn Tipton did not publicly address these accusations, however, Downing's definitive departure was a clear indication that Judas Priest had undergone a significant transformation. Glenn Tipton had dedicated his life to transforming Judas Priest into a legendary force in metal. However, the question remained as his body began to fail him. Could he persist despite the fact that his physical strength was no longer in harmony with his unyielding spirit? As Judas Priest continued their relentless march through the heavy metal world, Glenn Tipton found himself engaged in a distinct battle, one that was taking place within his own body. Glenn's dedication to the band was unwavering as they transitioned into a new era with Redeemer of Souls in 2014. He continued to write, perform, and give his all on stage in the 2010s. However, something seemed amiss. His hands, which were previously fluid, began to betray him. At times, his fingertips would become rigid, and subtle tremors would manifest, initially transient but gradually becoming more persistent. Glenn was aware that this was not a trivial matter, however, he convinced himself that he could manage it. Nevertheless, his physiology had other ideas. The symptoms had deteriorated by the time Judas Priest began recording Firepower in 2018. Riffs that were previously effortless now necessitated a significant amount of effort. He no longer perceived the instrument as an extension of himself, as it had been for over 40 years. The truth that he feared most was confirmed after numerous medical consultations. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Accepting this reality was devastating for a guitarist who had dedicated his entire life to the stage. However, Glenn did not disclose this information to anyone. He persevered, resolute in his determination to finish his segments on armament, contributing to an album that epitomized the principles of force, energy, and resilience that were the hallmarks of Judas Priest. However, Glenn Tipton was aware that he had to make the most difficult decision of his career as the band prepared for their world tour. He had to walk away from the stage. Glenn's decision to cease performing was not merely about leaving an employment, it was about renouncing the life he most cherished. However, he had never been the type of individual to allow hardship to influence his decision-making. He publicly stated that Judas Priest merited a spectacular tour and that he did not wish to impede the band. Consequently, he made the difficult decision to relinquish his role in live performances, transferring it to Andy Sneap, who is both the producer of Firepower and a proficient guitarist. However, Glenn Tipton continued to be an indispensable component of Judas Priest, despite his departure from full-time performance. He made surprise appearances during the encore on numerous evenings during the tour, performing timeless classics such as Metal Gods, Breaking the Law, and Living After Midnight. Tens of thousands of admirers were overcome with emotion each time Glenn entered the stage. Not only were they witnessing a performance, but they were also witnessing the unbreakable character of a true warrior. However, Glenn's struggle was not solely for his own benefit. He resolved to transform his ordeal into an inspiration for others. The Glenn Tipton Parkinson's Foundation, a charitable organization established by Judas Priest, is committed to providing support to patients worldwide and financing research for the disease. Rob Halford once stated that Glenn does not wish for anyone to feel pity for him. He is not that person, rather, he desires that individuals continue to live, fight, and perform music. Glenn's foundation received the proceeds of the Firepower tour, which were generously donated by thousands of supporters. Not only because Glenn Tipton was a renowned guitarist, but also because he had demonstrated the true essence of resilience in the face of life's most formidable obstacles. Glenn Tipton is among those guitarists who are remembered for their passion, while others are remembered for their speed and technique. The passion of a heavy metal warrior could never be taken away by Parkinson's disease, despite the fact that it may have hindered his ability to play as previously. Not only is he a musician, but he is also a representation of fortitude and resolve. Despite the fact that Judas Priest may continue their voyage, Glenn Tipton will forever be an indispensable component of their rich legacy. What are your thoughts on Glenn Tipton's conflict? What is it about him that most motivates you? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below and join us in celebrating a genuine legend. Personal life. Despite his status as a warrior on stage and a legend of Judas Priest, Glenn Tipton was a private man who refused to adopt the extravagant lifestyle that many rock stars embraced. Glenn did not engage in excessive partying or become embroiled in significant controversies, despite his membership in one of the most renowned heavy metal bands in history. He led a quiet, reserved personal existence that was meaningful in its own way, in stark contrast to Judas Priest's rebellious image. Glenn was married to Sue Tipton and had 2 children, Rick and Karina Tipton. Despite the fact that his profession necessitated extended periods of travel and separation from his family, he consistently endeavored to preserve a robust relationship with them. Glenn was never the subject of tabloid scandals or controversial affairs, in contrast to many musicians who were ensnared in the chaotic, reckless lifestyle of rock and roll. Family has consistently been his primary concern, in addition to music. According to those who knew Glenn Tipton personally, he was an individual who never pursued the limelight beyond his performances. Many rock guitarists lived extravagantly, consumed by alcohol, drugs, and countless affairs. Glenn, on the other hand, adopted a more practical approach. He devoted the majority of his time to his music, his family, and personal interests, favoring tranquil moments with his loved ones over the tumult of media scrutiny. Glenn's love for motor racing and fishing, in addition to his musical interests, served as a source of tranquility amid the high-pressure environment of heavy metal. He was frequently observed racing sports vehicles or relaxing by the water when he was not on stage or in the studio, savoring the tranquility that few rock stars have ever experienced. Glenn Tipton's humility was one of the characteristics that distinguished him from numerous other heavy metal legends. He never exhibited arrogance or sought to boast about his accomplishments, despite being one of the finest guitarists of the genre. Glenn seldom discussed himself during interviews. In contrast, he prioritized the collective spirit of Judas Priest, consistently recognizing the contributions of his bandmates rather than pursuing individual success. His colleagues and fans held him in high regard as a result of his humility. Despite his departure from the stage, Glenn Tipton's legacy endures not only through his music but also through his unwavering spirit, humility, and genuine artistry. He is not only a heavy metal legend, but also a representation of integrity and resilience. A man who was not only admired for his performances, but also for the manner in which he conducted his life. Life and legacy in the present day. Glenn Tipton remains an indispensable component of Judas Priest, despite the fact that he no longer performs on stage on a nightly basis. Despite his ongoing battle with Parkinson's disease, he has maintained his involvement with the band in recent years, preserving the ethos he has established over the course of more than 4 decades and producing music. Judas Priest released the album Invincible Shield in 2024. Despite his inability to perform on a regular basis, Glenn continued to contribute to the songwriting and recording of specific guitar sections, demonstrating that his metal spirit remained unwavering, despite his deteriorating health. He was no longer the sole figurehead of Judas Priest on stage, however, his signature was still evident in every melody and note, a legend that would endure forever. Glenn continues to make unexpected appearances at special Judas Priest concerts, despite his inability to participate in entire tours. The moment becomes unforgettable whenever he steps onto the stage during the encore and picks up his guitar to perform Metal Gods or Breaking the Law with the band. The audience erupts each time he appears, not only for the performance, but also because they are aware that they are witnessing a symbol of resilience, of the unyielding ethos of heavy metal. Glenn Tipton's legacy extends beyond music, as he continues to advocate for Parkinson's disease patients and promote awareness and support. The Glenn Tipton Parkinson's Foundation persists in its mission to assist patients worldwide and raise funds for research. His journey is not limited to music. He has served as an inspiration to millions who are currently engaged in their own struggles, demonstrating that the human spirit is capable of withstanding any adversity. However, Glenn Tipton's most significant contribution to the Parkinson's community and Judas Priest is not his most significant legacy. It is the manner in which he redefined the function of a guitarist in heavy metal. He was more than just an exceptional musician throughout his career. He was a musical architect who was truly visionary. His riffs had a profound impact on an entire generation, inspiring innumerable guitarists, including Dimebag Darrell, Mark Tremonti, Alter Bridge, Zakk Wylde, Pantera, Sinister Gates, and Avenged Sevenfold. Glenn Tipton is not only one of the finest guitarists in heavy metal history, but also a symbol of perseverance, as he reflects on his over 50 years of dedication to Judas Priest. Parkinson's disease may have impeded his progress, however, it was unable to quench the flame he had sparked in the realm of rock music. No matter how long Judas Priest continues their journey or how much heavy metal evolves, Glenn Tipton's name will eternally be inscribed in the genre's history. He has left behind more than just immortal music. He is evidence that rock and roll is not solely about technique or speed, but also about character, resilience, and an unwavering passion. Have you had any memorable interactions with Glenn Tipton? What is it about him that most motivates you? Please express your opinions in the remarks section below. If you are a fan of Glenn Tipton and his legacy, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel in order to continue your exploration of the stories of rock and roll luminaries. And don't fail to share this video with your friends. Let's ensure that Glenn Tipton's music and spirit remain alive in the hearts of heavy metal fans for eternity.